thus said, wake up, America, wake up, for we cannot stop, and we will not and cannot be patient.
Stand up, speak out. John Lewis, a multi-generation leader. John Lewis was referring to an America that was dormant to the injustices of segregation in the South. During the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, people of all races, ages, and colors came together to demand a federal law to give every American equality. John Lewis led and organized people to stand against the racist state laws and those who enforced it. He organized hundreds to join sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registrations, and marches to promote change. His leadership leaves a legacy today, inspiring millions by his tactics of nonviolence, which is still used as Americans continue to protest injustice. African Americans faced inequality even when they were freed from slavery in 1865. Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which entitled all Americans to citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which secured the right to vote. Unfortunately, white supremacists created unjust laws in their states, enforcing segregation. They were worried that their customs and traditions would fade away if they acknowledged African Americans as equals in the eyes of the law. These Jim Crow laws were tolerated by the federal government with the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court ruling. It ruled that separate but equal facilities were legal. The Jim Crow laws created a racial caste system, which was more concentrated in the southern and border states. Over 50 years later, the Supreme Court case of Brown v. the Board of Ed in 1954 ruled against Plessy v. Ferguson. It stated that separate was not equal. African Americans were promised change, but there wasn't any. Southern states refused to desegregate the schools, restaurants, parks, movie theaters, and other public facilities. These unfair actions caused people to believe that something was wrong, therefore furthering the start of the Civil Rights Movement. Leaders were needed to organize the masses in protest to demand laws for change. John Lewis organized young people to advocate immediate change through nonviolent protest. John Lewis took a stand against segregation at a very young age. John Lewis felt insulted that he had to be separated from other people because of his skin color.
At the age of 16, we went down to the public library trying to check out some books, and we were told by the librarian that the library was for whites only and not for color.
After hearing about the Brown v. the Board of Ed case in 1954 and the Emmett Till case of 1955, John Lewis was angry towards a political system that encouraged and allowed these actions. He teamed up with other young people in the organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. These students participated in nonviolent protest against segregation at local lunch counters. At these sit-ins, they would sit in a white-only area and order food while studying and would not move until they were served.
We sitting there, reading a book, working on a paper, or looking straight ahead, and someone would come up and spit on us, put lighted cigarettes out in our hair or down our backs, pour hot water, hot chocolate on us, pull us off the lunch counter stool, and from time to time we would be arrested and taken to jail.
We still abide by those rules that you are not to ever get violent. If it's time for you to be arrested, you get arrested. But you do not be violent.
He also participated in freedom rides. The Supreme Court ruled that bus terminals and facilities could not be segregated. Civil rights activists wanted to put the ruling into effect by creating freedom rides. Students traveled between states in mixed racial groups, challenging Southern customs that enforced segregation. At the age of 19, John Lewis was one student of SNCC, chosen by the Congress of Racial Equality, called CORE, to participate in the freedom rides, going down south on integrated buses. The buses were violently attacked by white mobs and state police arrested passengers, but it brought national attention to the South's disregard of the federal government ruling and the violence that enforced segregation. Because of his bravery and discipline, John Lewis was voted as chairman of SNCC in 1963 and held the position until 1966. John Lewis involved himself in other protests while being the chairman of SNCC. By the time he left the organization, he was known as one of the Big Six leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, side by side with Martin Luther King Jr. John Lewis participated in the 1963 March on Washington, where over 200,000 people went to see the Big Six civil rights leaders speak by the Lincoln Memorial. He was upset that the federal government didn't take much action in the South to enforce federal laws where segregation was the worst. He encouraged disciplined and orderly protest to promote change.
9 of our leaders have been indicted, not by the Dixiecrats, but by the federal government for peaceful protest. Those who have said be patient and wait, we must say that we cannot be patient. We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now.
After all of the nonviolent protests that John Lewis helped lead, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. On July 2, 1964, John Lewis was alongside President Lyndon Johnson when he signed the Civil Rights Act. This made the Jim Crow laws illegal, ending the segregation of public facilities.
This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
John Lewis led a voting registration campaign called Freedom Summer to persuade African Americans to register to vote, despite the mandatory literacy test and poll taxes. The climax of this campaign was in Selma, Alabama. Motivated to stage a peaceful protest, John Lewis led a march of 600 people from Selma to Montgomery on March 7, 1965, with Hosea Williams at his side. This day became known as Bloody Sunday. After church, Lewis led protesters to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they were attacked by state and local police with billy clubs and tear gas, driven back into Selma. John Lewis faced a fractured skull, similar to many protesters who were beaten unconscious. 2 days later, Dr. King led a symbolic march of 50,000 people to the bridge after receiving protection from the federal government. John Lewis's leadership in the Selma March had a big impact on the decision of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The publicity of the violent attacks on Bloody Sunday in Selma persuaded Congress and President Johnson to approve a Voting Rights Act as fast as possible. In August of 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. It took out any obstacles to voting, like taking unfair voter registration tests forced on only African Americans. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is in dispute today. In 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Shelby County, Alabama, to get rid of Section 5 in the Voting Rights Act. John Lewis stood up in that protest for preserving the right to vote. As a congressman in the House of Representatives today, John Lewis supports the Voter Empowerment Act, which eliminates voter fraud and ensures equal access to the ballot box for every voter. He uses social media to express his opinions on current events and protests going on around him. He uses his position as a congressman to spread the word of peaceful protest. He still makes attempts to stand up for other people's rights, even when the government denies it to them.
I've said in the past that the vote is precious. It is almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent instrument or tool we have in a democratic society.
I wanted to become a civil rights lawyer because I believe that that's the best way to protect the most people. And if we protect those whose voice often is not heard, then we're doing our job. And at that point, then we follow in the steps of John Lewis.
John Lewis has left a legacy as a leader for civil rights using nonviolent tactics to protest. He has inspired many people around the nation to speak up for civil rights. Because of John Lewis inspiring young people in the civil rights movement, today, people of all ages are empowered to protest against injustice. There are protests today that follow in the footsteps of John Lewis's leadership approach. In recent events, protesters have created die-ins similar to the sit-ins that were used in the 1960s. He stands up for civil rights of all people, despite their race, age, or sexual orientation. John Lewis's bravery and dedication throughout the civil rights movement furthered the integration of races, showing us that there is still hope no matter how much injustice we face. His participation in sit-ins, marches, and voter registrations in the face of dangerous opposition is an inspiration to many people. John Lewis continues the fight bravely for equal rights as a congressman who is involved in protest against discrimination. His legacy lives on in the voices of Americans protesting to ensure our equal rights in every aspect of society.
One day, when the war is won, we will be sure